Hello.
Our story begins with the Emperor climbing back into the floating Senate pod. His lungs tightened inside of his chest, and he clenched his neck. Palpatine's skin was sizzling. This was the second time in just a little over 24 hours that he'd been a victim of his own electricity, and now he had to pay the price. Similar to how his apprentice on Mustafar would soon be lit up into an explosion of fire, the Emperor himself was burned. The Force electricity fired back at him through Windu's lightsaber did his physical damage to his appearance, but it left a scare for Palpatine. If he experienced another burst of energy like that before his body healed, he'd be left with permanent damage. Of course, the medics that diagnosed the Emperor assumed that the Jedi did this to him, so they never considered warning him of using his powers. Sidious, in the heat of his duel with Master Yoda, was forced to rely on his remarkable skill with Force electricity. It was a power that he mastered early into his Sith career. Now it was a curse. Just below, without Palpatine's knowledge, the Jedi Grand Master decided to flee. Yoda came to the conclusion that he lost the duel, and that he needed to retreat. Sidious was forcing himself to his feet to defend himself from what would likely be his end. Luckily for the Sith Lord, he had nothing to worry about. The Jedi had fallen. The Grand Master, in his own mind, failed. Palpatine wasn't in the clear yet. He held his throat and stumbled through the seating inside the Senate pod. He croaked out demands for shock troopers, who eventually found him. The Emperor needed an escort to the Imperial medical structure. There was something very wrong with him. He could not breathe. It was like the very life force within him was draining at every passing second. If it weren't for the dark side of the Force, he'd probably be dead right now. And even for Sidious, that thought was terrifying. Yes, the Master of Darkness, Lord of Destruction, could understand fear. It was a deadly drug. It was something that filled his body and forced him to push these emotions deeper down. The Emperor feared this lack of control because he was so close to victory, and if Lord Vader returned from Mustafar to see a broken old man, then he would become the new Emperor. Palpatine recognized the natural succession of the Sith. A master must be prepared to die so that the lineage could continue. Sidious, though, never played by the rule of two. He thought about this in his short journey from the Executive Plaza to the medical structure. Palpatine knew that after he betrayed Maul and had Dooku killed, that it was only a matter of time until a student turned on him. In his current state, there was very little he could do to stop Anakin Skywalker. But the fear of facing Lord Vader at the height of his power slowly dissipated. By the time he reached the medical structure, he could sense that Lord Vader was in danger. The Emperor, as a result, dispatched his shock troopers to Mustafar, telling them to not return until Vader was discovered and rescued. As for Palpatine, his immense knowledge of the past provided him insight into the ways of the Sith, and how they managed to handle injuries like this. Someone like Darth Vitiate managed to essence transfer into multiple beings. He lived for centuries by doing so, and unfortunately it was a lost art form that Plagueis was so close to understanding. Palpatine reflected on Darth Nihilus and Darth Sion, two members of the Triumvirate, under Lord Krea's command. Nihilus was the Lord of Hunger, the one who feasted until his thirst was too great and it destroyed him. Or perhaps Darth Sion, who couldn't be killed. All of these reflections came from Sith legend. Palpatine knew what had been passed down, which could be either accurate or inaccurate. But the Emperor knew that there was one face, one Sith that would resemble what he needed to become. Darth Malgus, the bringer of chaos, the Sith Lord that managed to sack Coruscant in a triumphant victory for his empire back in the day. He was a powerful warrior, someone not especially gifted with the Force but incredibly strong, physically. Malgus required a mask and respirator because of a loss to a Jedi Master from his own time, and while Palpatine would never categorize his duel with Windu as a loss, he believed that this physical punishment was a result of his own power and simply being too strong for the husk of skin that he lived within. The magnificent ego of a Sith Lord could never get too out of hand, now could it? Sidious, regardless of what he wanted to believe, still had to face reality. He was unable to function without a respirator. His lungs were burnt to a crisp, his skin, not just on his neck and chest, was weak. This was, as the medical droids confirmed, a reaction to both instances of electricity. The first, with Master Windu, was the prolonged burning of his body. Everything from his feet to his head was covered in electricity. It definitely helped with the theatrics of looking powerless, but it damaged him greatly. While this specific injury was much more visible on the skin, the medics informed him that he would naturally heal at some point. His body might never look the same, but it would recover, and that's all that really mattered to Sidious. Yet because of the second encounter, the fight with Master Yoda, he developed internal injuries to his lungs and esophagus. Externally, Palpatine also had an array of new problems to deal with. When he fought Yoda, the two of them held a storm of electricity between them. This was much more prolonged than what Palpatine had to sustain against Mace Windu. Yes, because this is a what-if, the force fight between Yoda and Palpatine was longer, meaning that not only did his lungs burn up when that burst of electricity smashed into him and the Grand Master, but the unhealed skin from the previous engagement was torn up worse. Sidious didn't just receive the installation of a master respirator, making him resemble the late Sith Lord Malgus, but it also meant that he needed to become what Vader soon would, Heart Machine. Palpatine's time inside the suit wouldn't be forever like his apprentice, and he only needed about a full year. Yet because the Emperor wanted to maintain his public appearance, he rejected the doctor's suggested helmet. Palpatine would instead literally look the part of Darth Malgus. He'd be entirely covered from neck to toe in armor. Unlike what Vader would soon receive, it would be coated in an interior of Bacta, designed to help his skin heal faster, which the medical droids believed would help. But all of this left the Emperor in an interesting predicament. He and his apprentice were soon to be one and the same. Once Anakin returned from Mustafar, missing 3 of his most important limbs and burnt like a cookout sausage, he needed to undergo a similar operation to what Palpatine just exited. The Sith apprentice was defeated, and while his injuries were far worse than Palpatine's, it created an immediate dynamic that the Emperor did not like. With each of his previous students, he had some sort of power over them. With Maul, it was age. His Zabrak apprentice had a chance at overpowering him with his full potential, but he never had the opportunity to reach that. Dooku was vastly limited to his force potential because of his age, and that played a factor into how easy it would be for Palpatine to deal with him if he became problematic. Never did he need to fear a student, and what they could become until Anakin. And yet, despite both master and apprentice suffering from burn wounds and being forced into suits of armor, the dynamic was different. It did not favor Sidious. Even with all the built-in disadvantages to Vader's suit, the Dark Apprentice could still very easily overpower Palpatine physically. Without the protection of Force electricity, or even a strong connection to the Force, both individuals were at odd disadvantages. Now, luckily for Palpatine, his suit was built to mold around his body, unlike Vader's. The apprentice's armor was designed to basically make him float. Vader was significantly taller and larger than Anakin Skywalker, essentially forcing him to rely on the dark side more. If Vader experienced more pain, then he was more likely to remain a servant of evil. But even though Sidious might have had technical advancements with the suit of armor around his body, it wasn't operated by pure metal. Vader's suit was all metal aside from his torso because his limbs needed to actually be replaced, so his grip, arm, and physical strength would all be far greater than the elder Palpatine's even with the armor. It was simply something the Emperor had to make a mental note of. He couldn't really spare time on designing a different suit for Vader because if he wasted more time, chances are his apprentice would have died. He was just relieved that after the Jedi Purge and encountering the greatest combatants of the Clone War, they had survived. Now came the difficult part, creating and protecting the Empire to be. On Palpatine's side of things, there was genuine worry for putting himself back into the public spotlight. He of course decided it was necessary to train more, with his lightsaber and with the Force, since he couldn't rely anymore on electricity. Rationally, he worried that putting himself in the public eye might welcome the return of Master Yoda. There was no way that he could predict that the Grand Master removed himself from the galaxy by hiding on Dagobah. Sidious thought very little of the Jedi, but not even he thought that little of them. The fact that Yoda and Obi Wan could decide to return at any point actually frightened Palpatine. So while Vader was out in the galaxy hunting down the last of the Jedi, as he would have anyways, Sidious worried for the return of the Jedi. As for his actual public appearances, which slowly became more common, he reintroduced himself as this robotic figure. It did honestly turn some people away from him because he was genuinely frightening to look at. Children were terrified whenever he came on the news. Adults didn't even want to look at him, and the Separatists feared him more than anything or anyone else. Palpatine went from a scaly but seemingly kind-hearted old man to a shriveled-up Croatian with a mask and armor. He reflected war far more than he ever did as Chancellor. But this also provided the Emperor to be vulnerable with his constituents and his colleagues. He could tell them the harrowing tale of surviving his Jedi encounters to build up sympathy. It's just the fact that his face was terrifying. He reflected the Sith of the ancient days, and luckily for the Emperor, no one remembered any galactic history because why would they? Not important, is it? No one cared that he looked like Malgus because no one knew who that was. For Palpatine, it made keeping his public image a constant, while also presenting him with the opportunity to earn more support for the sacrifices he was willing to make for their new empire. Everything for Master and Apprentice remained relatively smooth for the first 2 or 3 months. Vader was broken up about Padme, but he was grateful to have his master. While there could be plenty of reasons for Vader to see his master as his cause of suffering, he didn't. Not to say that Lord Vader had some sense of empathy for the Emperor, but he understood him. They could understand each other because of what they were both enduring. Though Vader had no clue that Palpatine's treatment was only temporary, he reasonably assumed that both would be stuck in their armor forever. The armor for Palpatine wouldn't last that long, and aside from a respirator which would drastically shrink after the removal of the armor, the fate of Sidious and Vader were not synonymous. The man inside the massive suit of Darth Vader believed that Master and Apprentice could rule the galaxy together, but something consistently seemed off. Anakin was never able to come to the conclusion that Sidious lied to him, or manipulated him, or used him to destroy the Jedi. But there was something just on the tip of his tongue. It flared whenever the two Sith got into a heated exchange. Of course, because Sidious couldn't use his Force electricity, he couldn't directly put Vader into his place. It led to scolding, sure. Palpatine had no problem with telling his apprentice he messed up or failed at something, but the typical Sith punishment never came with it. So what ended up happening was Vader challenged his master more often than not. These scoldings were initially ones where Vader accepted his place and his mistake, before eventually deciding that maybe he wasn't totally in the wrong for something, thus standing up for himself. And what Vader noticed was a subtle change from his master whenever he decided that he didn't want to deal with Palpatine's outbursts. The Emperor showed just a tiny bit of fear. It was something Vader never saw from Palpatine, even when he was just a little old Chancellor. He, no matter what, never showed fear. So it was very noticeable to the Sith apprentice. It made him realize something about this dynamic, and yet Vader still struggled to piece it all together. There were 2 scenarios. Sidious was either too egotistical to accept that his student didn't make a mistake and that he, the master, was wrong, which for Anakin reminded him of Obi Wan Kenobi in many ways, or the alternative, more likely scenario that Vader leaned towards, the one being that Sidious feared his own apprentice because he too was stuck inside a suit. And unfortunately for the Emperor, he didn't have the natural dominating strength that Vader possessed with his metallic limbs. Obviously, because the Emperor knew his body would fully heal within the year, he had no intention to outfit himself with a more metallic body. But that's also because he never expected Vader's patience to run so short. Unsurprisingly, the apprentice's problems would be exacerbated by the training of the Inquisitors. To say that Vader hated them would be an understatement. He loathed just interacting with them. The only tolerable one was the former Temple Guard, because the rest of them were just cannon fodder. Palpatine knew they were, but they were designed to be used against survivors of the Purge, individuals to do the nitty-gritty work while Vader attended to empire building with his master. But that to Vader was the biggest problem. He couldn't stand the needless preaching by his master because he wasn't contributing to this quote-unquote empire building himself. He was just killing Jedi and doing whatever mundane tasks the Emperor asked of him. Vader exclaimed at his master in multiple arguments that he was just wasting countless hours on the development of trainees that didn't belong inside the Empire. The clones were more than enough to deal with a force of Jedi. If need be, Palpatine knew what the clones were capable of, but this, to the Emperor, was more than just killing Jedi. To Sidious, it was the symbolism of the Jedi at the height of their power being wiped out by a Shadow Sith Lord, and their youngest surrendering their souls to the dark side. It was the power of the darkness that mattered to the Emperor, the fact that their religion won the age-old war for dominance in the Force. But here's the thing, Vader didn't care about the Sith. Sure, he was grateful for the power of the dark side and how it kept him alive, but the Sith did not save his wife. Neither did the Jedi. So Vader had absolutely no reason to care about symbolism. What he told his master was that if the symbolism mattered so much, then he should be spending his time teaching the Inquisitors. The Emperor, at this, lowered his hand to his robes to draw his lightsaber, and Vader was already 2 steps ahead of him, igniting his own weapon. The classic bickering that destroyed the Sith for ages only continued with these two here. The Apprentice told his master that this argument could be handled without his defeat. They could settle things with words, and Palpatine shook his head, igniting his weapon. Each Sith swung in, colliding in a massive blast of light. Vader was clearly the stronger one here, and despite the training that Sidious did, he didn't have any real combat experience inside the armor. Their sabers moved slowly and heavily into attacks and defenses. Sidious tried to push with forms that were natural to him, but the truth is, he couldn't rely on them. Even during Palpatine's own training with himself, he tried to force things that clearly weren't working. The heavier armor, which again wasn't as heavy as Vader's, still forced Sidious to swing wider and heavier. He couldn't utilize the more acrobatic lightsaber form of Form 6 as he preferred, whereas someone like Vader didn't have to worry about switching forms. He continued to master the very aggressive Form 5, and with his suit, he was permitted a better chance to use his power behind the strikes. Even though Vader couldn't swing down over his head, as Skywalker preferred doing during the Clone War, he could still very easily disarm an opponent by bearing down on them with all of his strength. Sidious experienced this firsthand as he deflected strikes and tried to move speedily around his apprentice, which failed spectacularly. Palpatine was irritated throughout the duel, making him weaker and less focused. Vader experienced the pain of his armor every time he stepped off of Coruscant. In each engagement he had with a former Jedi, he gained a better understanding of his own limitations, whereas Sidious only used training droids, which he could outsmart absolutely, but not because of his technical skill inside the armor. He tried to outsmart his own student, which came in switching to other lightsaber forms that he knew, but none of that helped. Sidious was simply too weak, too unbalanced with his armor, and as a result, he was almost easily beaten by Lord Vader. Both struggled immensely with their injuries, but only one had to come to the understanding that this was the rest of the way his life would go. Sidious never had to truly accept that he'd forever be inside the suit, like his apprentice did. As a result, he never really took his training as seriously as Vader did, and he paid the price for his own lack of vision. But this defeat of the Emperor was not his death. Vader didn't even really want to kill his master, he just wanted to prove a point. Palpatine, after facing off against his apprentice, laid on the ground with a missing forearm and a destroyed lightsaber. He was so embarrassed, and Vader decided to have his master locked away, because this empire was about to become his own. See, as Vader realized after defeating Palpatine, he had the opportunity to do everything his way. This didn't need to come with the Emperor's death, just simply his acceptance of the changing winds. It started with Vader promising that if Palpatine remained cooperative, then he'd have nothing to fear. This was the apprentice asserting himself as free from the chains of the Sith path. No longer was he going to be directed by an ancient religion, not the Jedi and certainly not the Sith. In this proclamation to his defeated master, Vader explained that he would no longer serve as master and apprentice. This was now Vader's empire, and Palpatine would have the opportunity through trust to have input. But until then, Vader hauled his master off the ground. They were going to be separated, as the now free man decided on how he wanted to operate his new empire. It was as Anakin said on Mustafar, this regime was officially under his command. Lord Vader didn't take over the empire with a swift change of power. Instead, he proclaimed himself as Emperor Palpatine. Vader had the benefit of the full body suit and the helmet to conceal his actual identity. He could be anyone he wanted, and considering the fact that the Emperor was already well known for his respirator, it made sense for Vader to rise with a ruse. When the dark, shadowy creature arrived at the Senate Plaza to proclaim himself as Emperor Palpatine, he did so with the same type of theatrics people had come to accept from the late Emperor. No one thought to question this new appearance from their leader. Sure, the height and helmet may have increased the size of the Emperor greatly, it just wasn't enough for people to start questioning him, mostly out of fear. Vader recognized that he could simply play the politician's life and live as a monarch, because at the very worst, his role was a glorified moderator, someone who didn't need to do anything, but accept or deny things that came across Palpatine's desk. At best, he could influence the entire Imperial army, the motivations of the Senate, and the interests of the populace with propaganda. In his first few days with this power, Vader slowly came to understand what he really stepped into. It was challenging, especially after being a lapdog for a couple of months. His time as Palpatine's apprentice was far worse than anything Obi Wan did to him, or any moment spent as a Jedi specifically. And Vader didn't look back on his time as a Jedi with any fondness, it was just a comparison he was able to make. As Emperor, he lived like a king, and it all started with diagnosing how he could survive like Palpatine. He didn't want to live in a suit designed to suffocate him. The Vader suit was much harsher than Palpatine's because his master designed it to continuously torture him, which Palpatine wrongfully assumed would be enough. Imperial researchers, working on behalf of their new emperor, started drafting up ideas on how to break their leader out of his walking coffin. But that did leave the remaining question: where might the actual Palpatine be? Well, just because Vader defeated his old master, it didn't mean that he immediately killed him. Palpatine was actually confined to the Imperial Palace, the former Jedi Temple. Inside, because only a few select individuals knew that Vader wasn't Palpatine, the former Emperor was forced to fight and kill all the Inquisitors. Grand Inquisitor pledged allegiance to Palpatine, despite Vader's rise, and he died for that critical mistake. Beyond Sidious fighting off the Inquisitors, he was frequently tortured. The armor that was designed to help him heal was stripped from his body. He never had his wrist replaced, and the temperatures inside the temple would constantly fluctuate in order to discomfort his skin. Palpatine was suffering, rightly so in Vader's mind. No one knew he was there, and even though the royal guards would have pledged themselves to him, they had no clue that Vader wasn't Palpatine. The only reason the Sith Lord couldn't escape was due to the new Emperor locking the structure down. It forced Palpatine to reflect a lot. Now he was stuck in the same predicament that would have ailed Vader, except it was arguably worse because it was solitary confinement. Palpatine couldn't go out and kill Jedi or experiment with his new armor. He was simply stuck with his weakened skin, destroyed body, and unable to fully use his powers or escape with any aid. Palpatine was a prisoner in his own empire. It was miserable for him. So with constant pain circulating through his burnt skin and his respirator being his only company, he thought about his choices, his actions, how what he did to get here uprooted his perfect empire. Palpatine wasn't upset with destroying the Jedi or turning Anakin to the dark side. His main problem became how he treated Lord Vader. It was a weird line of thought for the Sith Emperor to go down. He considered revenge, but he was too frail to do that, and so he was left with varying thoughts. The first of which being if he would have the chance to exact his revenge, how he might do it. Secondly, if he escaped, would it be more beneficial to form an alliance with Vader until he became too comfortable and then kill him? Or even a third option, where he just remained allies. These were genuine considerations. All three of them benefited him greatly because he'd either return to Emperor or have great input on the Empire without having to slave away inside an office. And it was a very weird direction for Palpatine's thinking to take him down. He was never the one to regret his actions or his decisions. He was a Sith Lord. Momentary regret could have been his undoing throughout the Clone Wars. But this was the first time since he became Plagueis' apprentice that he didn't have a responsibility. The work of a Sith was challenging because it was an uphill battle consistently, and of course being the Emperor meant his work got more intense, not easier. Palpatine's willingness to question how he treated Lord Vader was front and center. Sidious obviously knew what kind of relationship he shared with Anakin. The whole mentor shtick came from Anakin's desire to find a fatherly figure in his life. He needed it, because Obi Wan wasn't always the most caring individual. It was this neglect that pushed Anakin into Palpatine's hands. It's why the Sith Lord considered this second and third approach, the one where maybe he was too harsh to Vader and he actually should have formed a stronger attachment. Palpatine only ever wanted to be in control, and the Vader he knew before their duel didn't desire the total domination over the Empire. Things could certainly change now that he was Emperor, but from Palpatine's perspective, he would still be in total control if he had taken his apprentice under his wing in a more caring way. This wasn't breaking away from the Sith path, rather just a different relationship with his student as Sith. They both suffered horrific injuries at the hands of the Jedi, and each were still fortunate to be alive long enough to see the rise of the Empire. Palpatine wondered how Vader might have been if he were given a similar outfit, an open-faced suit with armor that actually fit his body to heal it, rather than a machine that was so much larger and more painful. Would they have remained allies? Become closer? Could Vader grow more of an appreciation for everything Sidious did for him? These were mundane, circulating questions that filled every aspect of Palpatine's day. He couldn't do anything, and because he was stuck, he was forced to consider some of the most unthinkable quandaries he'd ever had. Outside the Imperial Palace, still on Coruscant, the Emperor continued to change Senate policies. Before this great betrayal, Sidious was putting in requests and motions to change the direction of the Empire. These came with new military expansion bills, the chain code system, the Imperial Energy Initiative, the secret construction of the Death Star, and more. Vader didn't care about superweapons or maintaining the Empire through terror, but he also, to clarify, didn't know much about maintaining a government. So once he did away with the Palpatine policies he didn't care for, he turned his attention towards the Outer Rim. Vader firstly rescinded any legislation designed to phase out the clone army. He then used the volunteers ushered in by the Imperial Stormtrooper bill to the front lines as local militias. So basically, he kept the clones safe and provided them with the care they deserved, while turning Imperial citizens into the cannon fodder that the clones had been for the past 3 years. It wasn't exactly the most liked policy, but it made a huge difference for the Empire. While Palpatine would have preferred to focus on Imperial territory and protecting it with super weapons, Vader wanted to expand it to the reaches of the Outer Rim. Criminal syndicates were growing by the day, and the Empire was too focused on keeping a paranoid, watchful eye over its own citizens. It led directly to Darth Vader leading campaigns on undefended worlds within Syndicate territory. It was rewarding for Vader. Sure, hunting Jedi made him feel good and strong, but nothing made him happier than crushing opponents like bugs. The Jedi had destroyed themselves. They were no longer of any concern to him. Plus, the fully functional and very capable clone commanders were handling survivors of the Purge. No longer did the Inquisitors burden him, thanks to his former master dealing with them. In contrast to the triumphant battles waged by Vader and removal of Palpatine-era policies inside the Senate, was Sidious, dwelling in silence. He still couldn't do anything. His wounds were healing much slower than they would have with his suit on, his connection to the Force was fading because he couldn't practice without tearing open his skin, and he was isolated. Palpatine, the evil Sith master that conquered the Republic and killed every opponent in his way, was caving. The second option regarding his treatment of Vader and forming an alliance with his former pupil became all the more alluring. Even the option where he didn't seek revenge. He knew that it would be his best interest to join Vader as an ally, not as a master. In that same line of thought, Sidious recognized how weak of a Sith it made him, but no longer could he live by these standards. Vader would keep him grounded for eternity, and Sidious didn't have eternity in these conditions. The constant memory of Dooku's helpless gaze on the invisible hand fueled this decision. Sidious knew that he couldn't do anything but conform, and that's the deal he prepared for Lord Vader's arrival. Palpatine reached out to his former apprentice, with the only communicator that worked inside the temple, to discuss his terms of surrender. The Dark Lord of the Sith, fresh from his campaign, accepted this request. Vader gave Palpatine a direct line of communication frequency, so that they could speak when the former Emperor learned to accept his real place in the galaxy. Sidious was truthful when he contacted Vader. He told him that he considered the options and decided that he no longer wanted to remain a prisoner inside the Imperial Palace, with nothing to do. He explained that he had a list of requests that he'd like to discuss. and Vader willingly took this offer. This was a Darth Vader who held all the power in the universe, someone who destroyed bands of pirates, ransacked Hutt territory, and was closing in on Darth Maul's location. The Shadow Lord would die by his hand, he was sure of it. Working out an agreement with Sidious was an act of mercy, something for Vader to say he was grateful to Palpatine for doing all the hard work with the Empire so he could commandeer it for himself. Vader was even willing to let Palpatine work on his alchemy in peace, as a true Sith Lord, as long as the way of the Sith didn't interfere with Vader's empire. All of these positions would be discussed inside the Great Hall of the Jedi Temple. Royal guards flanked Vader as he told Palpatine to give him his requests so that they could reach a mutual agreement. The royal guards who protected Vader had no clue that this was Palpatine across from them. He looked so disfigured that they didn't recognize him. Sidious only said that he wanted his armor back, a new hand, and a chance to be himself as a Sith. He wanted to truly form a relationship with Vader, not of master and apprentice, but of father and son. They could be two individuals with two separate directions in life, but Sidious just wanted his freedom. He then told Vader that he didn't want to interfere with the Empire, he just wanted freedom from this prison. And that's when it all clicked. Palpatine's desperation to free himself costed him everything he was. The former Emperor, not for a moment, could imagine letting his own dreams and ego sit aside. He couldn't just let the Empire he built from the ground up be stolen from him by some ungrateful pup like Vader. He was the dagger, not the anchor. Vader's role was to destroy the enemy and serve him, and Sidious realized that even if he wanted to enjoy the Empire, he couldn't relish in its success without him being at the top of it. The Sith Lord tried to harmonize with any tiny bit of sympathy he could, because he finally understood the agony Vader endured. But just tasting freedom was enough to remind him of how much power meant to him. He wouldn't be satisfied, not with having the freedom he currently desired, not by having his powers or a healing body. He needed complete and total control. At the mere hesitation in his response to Vader, the new Emperor ignited his lightsaber. Sidious channeled the dark side through his burning and destroyed skin as he tried to create a defense for himself, but nothing he would do could save him from what Vader would bring against him. The saber strikes were just the beginning, and the irony, or perhaps the beauty, from Vader's perspective, was the fact that he wouldn't even let Sidious back into the real world. The torture inside the temple wasn't even meant to end so early. He just wanted Sidious to experience just a little bit of the suffering he endured with the Vader suit. So Palpatine, because he hesitated during a confession, paid the ultimate price. Just after the murder of Sheev Palpatine, Vader received his brand new suit, which included a fitting armor set with limbs that actually fully attached to his body, an external respirator, and back to enhancements within the suit. Because he wasn't pledging himself to the Sith, he had no need to worry about the pure loyalty to the dark side. He only cared about saving himself and continuing to control the Empire, which he wouldn't. The galaxy had to wait on Vader. Expansion was the thrill that helped Darth Vader return to a semi-Anakin-like state. He never directly referred to himself as anything other than Emperor or Vader, but as this shell of Anakin, he returned to conquering. His skills with the saber and the Force continued to grow, and he felt more like his truest self. In many ways, accidentally, his actions inside the Senate reflected what his wife would have wanted. It wasn't always intentional, but after conquering his demons, the only real threat he cared about was Maul. Kenobi dropped off the face of the universe, and if he reappeared, then Vader would care. But in reality, by the time Obi Wan did, he wouldn't. Thanks in part to the policy and funding changes of the Galactic Empire, especially without a heavy focus on authoritarian policies, there were far less rebellions to worry about. Since the Emperor was leading crusades across the Outer Rim, there was room for galactic patriotism. What Anakin did to wipe out the crime families for pure entertainment became the source of empowerment for Imperial citizens. They were all worn down by the Clone War, which was a civil war. But destroying these seemingly helpless crime families was like a breath of fresh air. It was a target and enemy that wasn't a neighbor. The clones became heroes and the Empire grew without punishing its citizens or even the former separatists. It pushed more unity because they created a common enemy, which was beneficial for everyone, regardless of political affiliation inside the Empire. Because Vader didn't choose to build the Death Star or focus on policies that would have created the Rebel Alliance, there wouldn't be any mainstream pushback against his regime. Not even Saw Gerrera was regarded as an enemy, because the Empire stopped targeting him like an enemy. Anyone that worked for the Republic during the Clone War, that held weapons to kill battle droids, all became employed by the Empire or served by the Empire. All the work done in Palpatine's first half a year was walked back. Citizens that were heroes during the Age of the Republic were again seen as heroes during the reign of the Empire. Even though the military remained a permanent part of the Empire's growth, it never really grew beyond late Clone War size. Thanks to Palpatine's consumption of the major business powers, the banks, and the courts, there was very little corporate influence within the Senate, meaning Imperial senators, despite being corrupt and complacent during the Republic, had to change course to actually protect their constituents. All the corporations that backed the CIS no longer existed in large power nor in influence, and in a weird way, the death of Palpatine and the rise of Vader became a new golden age. Did this make the Empire the greatest era of galactic history for the galaxy? Not really. It was still a very vicious regime that brought plenty of destruction. It just wasn't enough to create a need for rebellion from within. Vader's empire wasn't complacent, nor was it just plain evil. It was rather just a tiny askew from totally corrupt. It was better than the Republic in some ways, and less harsh than what Palpatine's regime would have been in other ways. But from this empire, under Vader's control, came the destruction of both the Sith and the Jedi. There would still be Boken members like Kanan and Cal or Luke in the future, but none of these avenues would directly lead to the recreation of the Jedi Order. Instead, it'd have individuals like the aforementioned people taking up interests in the Force because it wasn't blacklisted by the regime, but doing nothing important with the Force. Yet, unfortunately for Vader, he would never knowingly meet his children. Luke found himself inside the Imperial Academy, but left once his contract expired. Leia met her father several times, and knew somewhere within her heart that they were related, but Bail never told her the truth, so she suspected that every time she met the Emperor, it was just some weird gut feeling that she eventually ignored. Despite still remaining a Darksider until the end of his life, Vader lived quite a fulfilling life. He was regarded as a galactic hero, even at his death. It wasn't the life he envisioned for himself and for Padme, but it certainly was far better than serving Sidious for the rest of his days. In that, Vader, even in darkness, lived a life of action, victory, knowledge, and peace. And that, my friends, is a dark side. It's like a neutral dark side story. Special thanks to all the patrons for supporting the channel. Smash the like button. Let's talk about this story. Definitely a neutral dark side story here, and that's really what I wanted to get out of this. There was a feeling going into this that I wanted you to feel as if Palpatine would almost turn to the light, or almost become like this neutral Darksider kind of gray Jedi type of thing. I wanted you to feel like there was a redemption in there for Palpatine, and that is the true irony of Palpatine. I know I've done Palpatine redemption stories, but this one is definitely meant to mislead you, meant to make you feel that he's going to do something that he's not going to do. I don't believe Palpatine, even in a what-if scenario, would be able to just sit and watch someone else rule his empire, because it is his empire. I think he'd be very off-put by that, and I think watching someone like his apprentice do it, I think that would piss him off even more. I think Palpatine in this scenario is especially vulnerable because he's put into a position as Vader, and he becomes Vader in his own way. He is literally the same thing as Vader, and that's why I wanted to tackle this scenario. It's definitely not the most interesting title concept, but I think it's definitely worth the time because it's putting Palpatine into the situation where he is literally just Vader without a full-blown helmet. And I think that created like this really interesting way for Vader to ascend to Emperor, because he starts to kind of see Palpatine as like a punk. He's like, oh, this guy's kind of just a punk. He's just Obi Wan but darker. And it's kind of that irony that he's able to rise to more power because he sees Palpatine for what he really is, a power-obsessed little man. And Vader takes advantage of that. And I think it's like a really interesting kind of psychological look at someone like Palpatine with what I guess we would call like a Napoleon complex. And so that was kind of the fun of the story. I hope you all enjoyed it. It's definitely more psychological. It's definitely more dark side oriented, but it's not total dark side, so it's kind of, you get this kind of like fun champion Vader thing, while also getting Palpatine to reflect a bit, but also still come to his own destruction by his own choices. So hope you all enjoyed. I love you all, spread the love, and always, my friends, may the Force be with you.